Hi, my name is Becky James, and for my graduate project in the health coaching class, I looked at how do we encourage more adolescents to walk and to bike to school. And this was an interesting thing for me because when you look at two of the greatest health concerns that are facing this age, which is mental health. And 22% of adolescents have experienced a major depressive episode, and suicide has risen to become the second leading cause of death in this age group. You also have obesity, which can pose health risks for young people, but the larger concern is that 80% of children who have obesity will grow up to be adults who have obesity, and that increases the risk of a negative outcome of a lot of the largest health concerns that are facing people in this country right now. And in both cases, physical activity has been shown to have a very positive impact on both mental health and having and maintaining a healthy body weight. So when you look at Healthy People 2030, to again take that broader look at physical activity in young people, what they're seeing is, their goal was to increase the portion of adolescents who get enough aerobic physical activity, and they have found it's going the other way. So the definition of enough is according to the Physical Activity Guidelines of Americans, and for this age group, it's 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity daily. And so you see that, overall, not only did it decline from 2017 to 2019, but you do see this steady decrease as people age. They appear to become less active. So why is physical activity in adolescence important? What is it associated with? Again, when you look directly at mental health, it's associated with increased self-esteem and decreased depression and anxiety. Interestingly, people with or children with who have obesity are actually more likely to be bullied, which again starts to pull those pieces from obesity and mental health together. But it also has an improvement on their academic performance, increasing attention and cognition. And one of the most important things that we can see is the habits that you form as a young person increase the likelihood that you will continue them as an adult. And being that healthy adult is what is associated with reducing the risk for developing chronic disease. So starting to narrow in, going from looking at physical activity more broadly to specifically starting to look at the goal, again, Healthy People 2030, was to increase the portion of adolescents who walk or bike to get places. I wanted to look specifically at schools. Most students are spending about 180 days per year, so in school. And so school offers this really kind of consistent destination. For a lot of people, it is a closer destination. And that's something that we'll talk about in just a second, of how that trend is changing in our country. But what we've seen is that, in 1969, you had a really high percentage of people who were walking and biking. And what you're finding is that in 2009, it was down to 13, and by 2017, it had declined to 10%. And so, we need to look and start to dig in is, why is this occurring? But what I wanted to look at before is, okay, if this is declining, why is it so important that we change this trend? So when you start to connect active transportation with obesity rates, what you see is that in countries with the highest percentage of trips that are completed by walking and biking, they have the lower rates of obesity. And what you find is that in the United States, we have some of the lowest walking, biking, and transit trips throughout the world. And so again, you start to see, though, that we also have some of the highest obesity rates. So there is this major connection of how do you choose to move about your day with obesity. So this is also one of my favorite studies that shows why active transportation is so important and such an important piece when we look at long-term health. And that is because it's got this stickiness that doesn't always exist with structured physical activity. And even the American Academy of Pediatrics said that lifestyle physical activity seems to be more important for sustained weight loss than structured exercise. And again, that's that stickiness. So this amazing study looked at two groups of people. There was a structured exercise group and there was a lifestyle group. The lifestyle group was asked to get 30 minutes per day in whatever way worked with their lifestyle. And what they found was that at that initial 6-month mark, there were some differences between the structured exercise and lifestyle. One of the larger ones was there was a larger change in their VO2 max. But what you found is that as all of this came out across 24 months, what you found was that both groups increased their energy expenditure, but that lifestyle group came to be right there in alignment with that structured activity and did not see the fall off that the structured activity group saw. And if you looked at both of the groups, the structured and the lifestyle groups, they both had similar improvements in cardiovascular fitness and cholesterol levels. And though neither saw a significant reduction in body weight, they did see a reduction in the percentage of body fat. So, when we're wanting people to, choose something that they're going to stick with to see these long-term health benefits, what we're seeming to see is that active transportation may be a great option, but it's not just physical health that we're looking at when we say that, active transportation is good for you. And, a lot of us focus on, the environmental piece. And yes, riding and walking can be, tremendous for the environment. The other piece that we look at when we're talking about adults that I did not include here as children is the financial benefit of walking and riding, which is just a fraction of the cost of owning and maintaining a car. But one of the interesting things when you look at well-being is we're starting to see how vital the role of connectivity is. And one of the advantages of choosing to ride or to bike is that you're not isolated in your car. And so the people who are out walking and biking have lower levels of reported loneliness. So it impacts all kinds of the dimensions of well-being, but that social connectivity one is one that just it makes me smile. And anecdotally, it's one that it's more the mental health and the social connectivity that if you talk to bike commuters, that you'll hear them talk about almost more frequently than their physical health is how much it means to them from other perspectives. So the question becomes, you've got all of these benefits. You've got this fact that, hey, if we can get you started in this, you're likely to continue doing it. So why aren't students walking and biking to school? And so this was a study that was done in 2004, but it asked parents who ultimately make the decision for how their student will get to school, why aren't you doing this? And so the number one reason, overwhelmingly, was that they live too far away. And the others, though very, very important, some of them are actually, you'll start to see they may not exactly be what we think that they are, but also a lot of them come from the society in which we live. And so when you talk about the growing distance, what you see is that in 1969, 50% of students only 50% of students lived more than a mile from their school. So, students were very, very close. But by 2001, the number had grown to only approximately 25% of students lived within a mile of their school, and 75% lived beyond a mile. And so part of what was happening is that in the 1970s, we had a lot of older school buildings. And if you look around in your communities, you'll see a lot of these conversions of really old, classic looking school buildings. But all of a sudden they're lofts and they're condominiums and things like that. And so you see how close they were together. But what happened was in the 1970s, those older buildings needed to be redone. And so land was cheaper if you moved those schools further out and away from where land was more valuable, because people were wanting to buy it to build their homes. So they moved these schools out and away from centers of population, which not only made those students travel further to get to those schools, but the schools could be larger. So all of a sudden the zones of the schools were pulling from much larger destinations. And you fast forward to 2017, and the average high schooler is about 6 miles from their school, and an elementary school child is about 3.6 miles from their school. And so that's part of why you start to see these changes and how people are getting there. But distance may not necessarily be the only factor with that. Because what you start to realize is that, okay, so if the goal is to, reach an hour of activity, then, you need at least a mile for somebody to walk to school. Or to get that full mile, you would almost have to bike 6 miles. And the other trade-off that you start to see is when you look at time, in a lot of cases, particularly in urban areas, you're going to see that riding in particular is much more efficient, especially for trips under 3 miles. And so, the average trip time in a vehicle for a student is about 21 minutes. And so you start to compare that to your times up above, and you see that walking and biking may be efficient even for what might be perceived of as a longer distance. But what you start to see, and this is really important, is that in the United States, walking and biking are not as accepted as they could and should be and are in other countries. And so you see how few relative trips that we're taking, even for shorter distances, and the number that is used when looking at transportation and public health for how long you can say that a person in the United States will choose to walk versus drive, and it's only about a half a mile or about a 5-minute walk. So it's really, really short. So there's this big call. So the thing that you're seeing on the right, or excuse me, on the left, was a piece from the Surgeon General, and the call that they made to really encourage active transportation. And what I did that because is when you come across and you start to look at the socio-ecological model, which is saying that the pieces of the individual are going to be the easiest changes to implement, but it's these pieces that are outside that will have the greatest influence upon the individual. Also having that huge impact on the individual makes it harder for those things to be implemented and to change. But when you change these things around the individual is when you make it more likely that their individual behavior will change. And so we have a lot of different groups working in this country to encourage active transportation from different ways. One of them is the CDC, who developed the program Active People, Healthy Nation. And so as you see, their top priority is to create activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations. And so this really awesome resource called the Community Guide, and what they do is that they look at interventions that are proven effective in the real world at protecting and improving health. And so what they have put out there is that, when you look at these two different pieces of transportation and infrastructure, so again, looking at what's going to be in these cities, and then looking at, your policies, these zoning pieces. So again, all of these things that, are going to look more toward a role of advocacy in changing these things, or increasing the infrastructure available to make it safer to walk and ride. But when you put these things together is where they're saying that you really do see these changes in the behavior of people choosing to walk or choosing to ride. And that when you do these things, that it is associated with higher levels of physical activity overall, and total walking biking in particular. So the CDC's Active People Healthy Nation also they look at community-wide campaigns to educate and to raise awareness, and they do specifically go after populations that are underrepresented in active transportation for various reasons, and they seek to show people in their communities in these roles to show that there is a place for these different populations within active transportation. They also have sought to improve social supports and individual support. But again, that top priority has been looking at your infrastructure and your zoning, so changing policy and advocacy. The other group that's really, really interesting, and people see them a lot more, is the League of American Bicyclists. And so they are a nonprofit organization. And so they seek to amplify the voices of local groups, whether an advocacy group or individuals that are doing great things in the community and advocating nationwide. And so one of the places where you're going to start to see them is with their Bicycle Friendly America campaign. And so Kent State is a bronze level campus, and they will renew in 2023. So you can look up if you want to be involved. Your all's program is run out of your recreation department. But so that does a lot. The Bicycle Friendly America is a form of recognition, and it's generally going to be so highly regarded in a lot of universities. It's in their strategic plans to become a BFA school. So now the other interesting thing is not only do they advocate and they encourage the Bicycle Friendly America program, but they the League of American Cyclists offers Smart Cycling, which is education in riding, and riding education is vital, is particularly in adolescent groups, because these people are not familiar with riding as a form of transportation versus a toy, which is how it's perceived of more now. And so Smart Cycling offers that. It also trains and has the gold standard of training for cycling educators in our country. And so the final organization that I looked at was Safe Routes to Schools, and the National Center for Safe Routes to Schools. And so they have two different pieces. So Safe Routes to Schools gives a framework and helps individuals within the community to look at their very own specific situations and figure out, what do we need to do in our community or in our school to improve safety, to encourage people to walk or ride. And the other thing that they do is to look at, they're the leaders of Vision Zero Youth, which is, of course, we're largely connected to Vision Zero, which is, the goal that encourages people to focus on safety improvements and drive down the number of fatalities associated with active transportation to zero. So in a lot of these, you've heard that we're advocating for infrastructure changes and we're advocating for policy changes. And, there are all these things about making riding safer. And if you think back to, the pie chart, a lot of parents are concerned about safety, but a lot more were concerned about distance. But what you find is that if you can cover that distance safely, distance itself is not a problem. It is how safely and securely you can, traverse that distance. And so, there are a lot of people that are in this advocacy space, and it is vitally important because speed kills. One of the first things you look at with Vision Zero towns is that they're going to look to reduce the speed limit to 25 because you're more likely to be able to survive a crash, whether as a pedestrian or as a person who rides a bike, than you are at 35 miles per hour. But also when you're talking about engineering and you add in this infrastructure. So this protected cycle track here was really awesome. And what it did was it took, to show the power of infrastructure changes, it took the bike count from 2 per day before this protected piece was added to over 40 per day after this bike lane was implemented. And so you can see there's a massive jump when you look just at engineering on our roads to make riding and walking safer. So, again, that's why you have so many in that space of advocating for these changes that will make riding safer, will make cities friendlier. The population density comes down, you've got more things in one area, things come closer together. It's answering the concerns of those parents, which is vital. But there's still places where we need help. And one of the places where I focused in is the importance of education. And we don't have a lot of riding safety education in our schools. And only about 20% of elementary and middle schools have these Safe Routes to Schools programming. And education and encouragement, it's estimated, could lead to a 25% relative increase in walking and biking to and from school. But what is interesting about education is that the effect of it is deemed to be cumulative. And so it's got to be that it is implemented very consistently across time, and that it's got to be appropriate for the various ages and development of the students to which you're teaching. And so what you had was a program was created and written that would actually present this ready to implement, ready to go, everything laid out. That so it's easy to for physical education instructors and recreational instructors to implement. And they do get 2 days of training. Now, granted, they do not get the League of American Bicyclists training, but they're still getting training. And that is vital when you're looking at educators for riding, because it's not always intuitive with riding. So you need people who have experience with it. But here's this implementable program that actually asks kids not just to regurgitate information, but also to think critically about, well, why do I need to wear a helmet? And this program addresses some of the largest concerns that face students from the perspective of education, and that it's not just time looking at a screen. It also includes time on the bike. But it also addresses parent education. So most of the parents who are raising students right now saw the bike as a toy also. And so a lot of the crashes that we're seeing actually could have been prevented with better information from these individuals. A lot of it is connected to sidewalk riding. But it also addresses the role of parents as role models, as a role model that wears a helmet, as a role model that rides safely, and as a role model who drives safely. And it talks about the role of drivers in improving safety on our roads. And so, what you've seen is that I've kind of divided out and focused a lot more on the education with writing, but the needs with writing are very, very different from the needs with biking. And so that's why you'll also see in a lot of cities that you have different advocacy groups working to encourage both. But the best thing about Bikeology is that it actually aligns with the national standards for K through 12 physical education, so it can fully be implemented in schools. So that means you don't need a champion that is going to put in your safe routes to school things. You aren't relying upon a volunteer. You can have this every year in your school consistently for kids, saying, here's information on how to help you ride safely, and here is this notion that riding isn't just a toy, and walking isn't just half a mile. You can do this. It empowers them. It puts them in this positive place. It educates them and gives them these positive experiences, so they have this full belief and this knowledge that they can ride and they can walk, and these opportunities exist, and they know how to do it safely. So what is the role for health educators? One, health educators need to appreciate the value of active transportation. A lot of people who don't ride or bike don't fully appreciate that value of what riding and biking does for health. So make sure that you do understand it. And learn more about the League of American Bicyclists programs and the Safe Routes to Schools and all of these different strategies that exist on all of these different levels, and how they could help your school or your community. And finally, advocate for the implementation of policies and changes to the built environment. And, again, a lot of people look at riding and they don't understand the value that it can represent to physical health, to mental health, to improving and changing well-being, and to improving and changing our communities. And if we have educators who are informed, then we can actually, help policymakers, et cetera, and advocate for these changes that can make a tremendous difference for students.